Some people leave a mark on the world with loud gestures. Camden Rowe was not one of them. He moved through life like a whisper, precise, polite, and always on time. But at St. Clair Hospital in rural Minnesota, where trauma arrived every hour and people rarely had the time to ask about anything beyond vitals and blood pressure, Camden had carved out a reputation as someone you could trust, with everything except his truth. 15 years in the ER hadn't hardened him, but they had taught him the value of silence. He never spoke about life outside the hospital walls. No family photos at his desk. No stories about weekend trips. No mention of holidays spent with a partner or alone. People respected that, maybe even admired it. He's just private. They'd say, old school, all about the work. And they were right, except none of them knew that the very thing Camden hid was the same thing that shaped how fiercely he protected his patients, how tenderly he stitched up teenage runaways and sat quietly next to veterans with shaking hands. He'd known he was gay long before medical school, but one moment changed the course of his life. His mentor, a senior surgeon, was outed during a faculty dinner. By Monday, the surgeon was reassigned, his leadership opportunities quietly withdrawn, and a once proud man began leaving meetings early, avoiding eye contact. Camden saw it all, and in that silence, he learned excellence couldn't always protect you. So Camden became the best, but not the fullest version of himself. He mastered everything but visibility, and no one noticed, until the day he submitted his resignation. It wasn't dramatic, no breakdown, no scandal. Just a formal letter in a beige folder, quietly handed to HR after a double shift. Camden packed his locker like he was going on vacation, nodded goodbye to the night nurses, and disappeared before anyone thought to ask why. But that wasn't the beginning of his exit. The unraveling had started months earlier, with something seemingly harmless, a lunch break conversation he wasn't even part of. A group of interns had been talking about LGBTQ visibility in medicine. One of them, Jesse, had said something simple. "I've never seen a gay doctor who's open about it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just dreaming too big." The others chuckled and moved on. Camden didn't. He'd been passing by, heard it like a whisper carved into bone. He couldn't unhear it. From that moment, every quiet morning, every shift he ended with a long walk to his car, felt different. That single sentence from someone barely out of school cracked open something Camden had sealed for too long. He had never been ashamed of who he was, just cautious. But now that caution felt like betrayal, not to himself, but to those coming after. And yet, he didn't speak. Not directly, not with Jesse, not with anyone. He knew visibility could cost things opportunities, respect, even peace, but he also knew that silence sometimes cost more. That's why, on his final night at the hospital, Camden didn't just leave. He went to a place he hadn't visited since residency, the hospital library. Tucked behind outdated journals and thick policy binders was a section no one really used anymore. There, in a dusty row of ethics textbooks, he slid an envelope deep into the pages of a book titled Human Ethics in Emergency Medicine. Then he walked out, leaving behind no farewell speech, no public goodbye, only the faint scent of antiseptic, and a note no one had seen. Yet, if Camden's quiet act moved you, follow Hard Stories for more stories that honor unseen lives and unspoken courage. Camden Rowe had mastered the art of invisibility long before his first white coat. While others learned to present symptoms, he learned to present stillness. Stillness was safe. It gave people nothing to question, nothing to confront. It was easier to be the man who worked late, who covered shifts, who always knew the right protocol, than to be the man who might need something himself. In his apartment, there were no signs of a shared life. The walls were bare, save for a single landscape photograph, a foggy coastline somewhere in Oregon. No frames with smiling faces, no old letters pinned to the fridge. The silence in the space didn't bother him. It was predictable, and predictability had always been a kind of comfort. But inside that comfort lived memories he never touched. There was the night during residency when he sat in his car outside a club for 2 hours, watching people come and go, but never stepping out. There was the invitation he declined to his first hospital's LGBTQ staff mixer, and there was the email he once wrote, but never sent, telling his brother the truth. Camden had always believed that if he kept his life contained, he could avoid loss. But what he couldn't admit, not even to himself, was that he had already lost something deeper, a version of himself that never had the chance to breathe in daylight. And in the place of that version stood a man who could perform miracles on others, but left his own wounds untreated. His colleagues never asked why he spent holidays alone. They assumed he preferred it. Over time, Camden began to believe they were right. Loneliness, when practiced long enough, becomes a second language. You start to confuse it with independence. You start to call it strength. But Jesse's offhand comment that day didn't fade like the rest. It stayed with him, echoing in quiet places. I've never seen a gay doctor who's open about it. Camden wasn't sure if it was grief or guilt that followed him home that week. He found himself staring at his own reflection more than usual. Not in a vain way, but as if trying to find someone beneath the years of practiced distance. One morning, in the break room, he noticed Jesse again. The younger man was flipping through a medical journal, oblivious to the weight his words had placed on someone else's shoulders. Camden stood behind him for a second longer than usual, watching the way Jesse's eyes lit up over an article about trauma response innovation. And in that split second, Camden saw not just a student, but a mirror. What if someone like Jesse could grow into the kind of doctor who didn't have to compartmentalize to survive? What if the next generation didn't have to pay the same quiet price? That's when Camden knew his departure couldn't be just a silent vanishing. He had nothing dramatic to say, no shocking confession, but he did have a story, and stories, even quiet ones, could outlast fear if placed in the right hands. He began writing that night. Not an autobiography, not a manifesto, just a letter, honest, spare, and careful. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply told the truth, that he was gay, that he chose silence because of what he'd seen, that he had no regrets about his career, but he wished someone like him had spoken up earlier. That visibility didn't require a stage, sometimes it only needed a page. He signed it CR. No name, no credentials. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want recognition. He wanted anyone who stumbled across it to know they weren't alone. That even in a field built on evidence and charts and logic, there was still room for stories, real ones, unspoken ones. The letter stayed on his desk for a week before he brought it to the library. Every day, he second-guessed it. What if no one ever found it? What if someone did and didn't care? But deeper than doubt was a quiet conviction that for the first time in years, he wasn't hiding. He was choosing. Not just to leave, but to leave something behind, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to shout who you are, it's to let someone else find you, exactly as you are, and recognize themselves in your silence. Camden folded the letter once, placed it in a plain envelope, and wrote a single line on the front, for the one who's still wondering. And that was enough. The hospital library at St. Clair had long fallen out of fashion. It was where old residents left flashcards in forgotten drawers, where textbooks sat under layers of dust, and where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like relics of a quieter era. Most staff found what they needed online now. The library was just another hallway to walk past. But for Jesse, it offered something different. He liked its quiet corners during long shifts, the way the silence wrapped around him after hours of beeping monitors and urgent voices. He didn't go there often, but when he did, it was never just about the books. It was a place where time paused. One late afternoon, a storm rolled over Minnesota. Thunder low, steady. Jesse, off-duty and restless, wandered into the library. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just needed to think, and the break room felt too loud with its microwaved leftovers and half-hearted small talk. He pulled a book from the middle shelf almost at random, Human Ethics and Emergency Medicine. The title didn't interest him much, but the spine wasn't cracked, and something about that made him curious. Inside, midway through a chapter on patient confidentiality, he found it in an envelope, plain, soft-edged, aged by a few days but untouched. He almost dismissed it as a misplaced note until he saw the handwriting, simple, even, with one sentence written across the front for the one who's still wondering. He hesitated, then opened it. At first, he didn't understand what he was reading. There was no name, no date, just a voice steady, deliberate. The letter spoke of watching someone brilliant be erased by a whisper. It spoke of caution becoming a lifestyle. It spoke of living two lives, one visible, one authentic, and how the visible one always won. And it ended with something Jesse hadn't expected, not regret, not bitterness, but a wish. A wish that someone younger might have it easier, might not need to carve out two selves just to survive. Jesse read it once, then again. Something about it landed deep, as if someone had opened a window in a locked room he hadn't realized he'd been sitting in. He wasn't out at the hospital either, not fully. He had friends who knew, his roommate, maybe his sister. But at work, it felt risky. Too early in his career, too fragile a ladder to climb. And yet here it was, proof that someone had walked the path before him, quietly, carefully, leaving behind not a trail, but a sign. He read the letter a third time before slipping it back into the envelope. He didn't take it with him. Something told him it wasn't his to own, only to witness. It belonged to anyone else who might stumble upon it, searching for something else entirely. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Dr. Rowe, not because he suspected the letter came from him, not at first, but because the absence he left behind had suddenly become louder than any presence. Camden had resigned so quietly. No goodbye lunch, no final round of coffee, just gone. Jesse remembered thinking how strange that was for someone who had stayed so long, trained so many, saved so many. It didn't sit right, but now it made sense. The letter wasn't just a confession, it was a farewell, and it was more than that. It was a passing of weight, not a burden, but a responsibility to be braver, or at the very least, less silent. A few days later, Jesse began his first night shift alone. Camden's absence was felt most in the small things: the second cup of coffee no longer brewed at 2 a.m., the chart notes more clinical than caring, the corners of the ER suddenly colder. As Jesse walked through triage that night, he paused near the lockers. His gaze landed on the one Camden had used. Empty now, clean, but the key slot still had a faint scratch below it, the kind made by years of tired hands. He reached out, touched it, then pulled his hand back. Not because anyone was watching, but because he suddenly realized something. There are people who vanish from places, but not from memory. The letter had no name, but Jesse no longer needed one. Winter came early that year. The wind in Minnesota turned sharp by late October, and every shift seemed to start and end in darkness. At St. Clair Hospital, life moved on. New residents arrived. Schedules changed. Patients came and went. Camden Rowe's name faded from the rotation list like steam on glass. But for Jesse, the echo remained. He didn't speak of the letter, not to his peers, not to the nurses who still spoke fondly of Dr. Rowe's calm. It felt sacred, like interrupting a moment that hadn't fully finished. But something in Jesse had shifted, quietly, then irreversibly. He began staying late after shifts, reading alone in the library Camden once walked through. He started noticing things differently. Like how rarely the hospital celebrated its queer staff, how diversity was something printed on flyers, but rarely acknowledged in rooms where decisions were made. How, even now, the joke someone made in the staff room about a sensitive male nurse went unchallenged. Jesse never thought of himself as political, but silence, he realized, was a kind of permission. And after reading that letter, he couldn't give it anymore. Still, coming out wasn't something he did all at once. It began with small acts. A correction here, a hello gaze there. He added a subtle pride sticker to his badge lanyard, not flashy, not loud, just enough. And slowly, a few others responded. A nurse nodded. A fellow intern quietly asked where he got it. No confessions, just recognition. But it wasn't until a new medical student joined his rotation that Jesse understood what Camden might have hoped for. Her name was Rena, and on her first day she wore a small rainbow heart on the corner of her coat. It was the kind of thing Jesse would have hidden his first week. He noticed her shrink a little after a snide comment from a resident about bringing politics into patient care. Jesse didn't speak up immediately, but that night he wrote her a note. Just a sentence. "You're not alone in this hospital." He left it in her locker. No signature. Only a tiny sticker in the corner, the same pride flag Camden had once described in his letter. She never asked who wrote it, but the next day she wore the pin again. And Jesse knew. What Camden had left behind wasn't just a story, it was a choice, a permission. The letter didn't need to be framed or published. It only needed to be read and remembered. The real twist didn't come in a dramatic confrontation or a public reveal. It came in a chain of moments no one would have seen from the outside. An attending nurse started asking more thoughtful questions about pronouns. A team lead created a support channel for underrepresented residents. And one night, Jesse walked past the library and saw the book Human Ethics in Emergency Medicine missing from the shelf. He checked the desk. No log, no checkout. Someone had found it. He didn't know who, but that wasn't the point. Later that month, during a hospital wellness event, Jesse volunteered to speak. Nothing formal, just a brief reflection. He didn't mention Camden by name, but he shared the idea of legacy, of invisible mentorship, of the weight of representation. He spoke about the power of leaving something behind for someone you may never meet. And when he finished, a few people clapped politely. One or two looked uncomfortable. But someone in the back, the janitor Jesse had never spoken to, gave him a thumbs up. That night, Jesse passed Camden's old locker again. Still empty, still clean. He pulled a small sticker from his wallet, the same one he had placed on the note to Rena, and pressed it inside the locker door, just beneath the hook where a stethoscope once hung. No one else would notice it, but it was enough. Snow covered everything that winter. By January, the sidewalks outside St. Clair Hospital were lined with pain and silence. Inside, the days blurred, patients arriving in waves, crises unfolding, then fading just as quickly. It was the rhythm of emergency medicine, constant, demanding, and rarely reflective. Yet in quiet corners, something lingered, something unspoken, but undeniably present. Jesse's routine had changed, even if others hadn't noticed. He moved through the hospital with a steadier kind of conviction. He didn't seek attention or applause, but he no longer dodged questions either. When asked about life outside medicine, he answered honestly. When assumptions were made, he gently corrected them. When a younger intern once nervously asked, "Is it okay if I tell people I'm queer?" Jesse smiled and replied, "Only if you want to. But just know it's more than okay." In one of those strange full-circle moments life sometimes offers, Jesse was assigned to a panel reviewing updates to the hospital's training materials. As he flipped through the outdated documents, he saw a familiar phrase: personal details should not interfere with professionalism. Something in him paused. He raised his hand and spoke. Not with fire, not with anger, just clarity. "It's time we stop treating identity like a risk factor." The room fell quiet, but someone took notes. A few weeks later, a new binder was added to the onboarding shelf: inclusion, compassion, and care in practice. Inside it was a chapter titled Unseen Contributions, featuring anonymous stories from past staff. Jesse had submitted Camden's letter edited only for grammar, never for truth. It was listed under voices that helped without speaking. Spring began to creep back into the city. Melting snow revealed forgotten things: lost gloves, broken branches, sidewalk chalk that had waited all winter. One evening, while reorganizing old files in the library archive, a volunteer found a weathered envelope tucked into the back of a book. She brought it to the front desk. Unsure what to do, the librarian read the first line, grew very still, then carefully placed it back where it came from. Some stories weren't meant to be filed away. They were meant to stay waiting for the next person who needed them. In Camden Rowe, He was never seen again at Sinclair. No emails, no holiday cards, no social media trail. But once, in late June, a letter arrived addressed to the ER department. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of a coastline gray sky, jagged rocks, a man walking away from the camera. Written on the back were 4 words: still here, still me. No one claimed it. No one needed to. The photo now sits pinned to the staff room corkboard, tucked beneath the shift calendar. No name, no explanation, just a quiet image of man leaving, but never lost. And sometimes, during the longest shifts, when the air grows heavy and the cases never end, someone will pause beside it, read the words, and remember. Because not every legacy is loud. Some speak softly, through lives touched and silences broken, through a sticker on a locker, a line in a handbook. A question answered without fear. Some people vanish from places, but remain in the spaces they made safe. Camden Rowe never came out at work, but somehow he made it possible for others to never need to hide. If you've ever been shaped by someone who never asked for recognition, who simply lived with quiet courage, who was that person for you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more true stories that live long after the last goodbye.